fight well, worthy of the name Belmont.
In my recent video on Castlevania Nocturne Season 2, which Netflix needs to hurry up and renew already, I felt that I didn't really have much to say about Richter Belmont. His arc panned out more or less how I thought it would, with him finally becoming the powerful hero he is in the games, and then sailing off with Annette, where nothing horrible is going to happen that will trigger the events of a Symphony of the Night adaptation.
Maria, take Richter and leave here. I'll finish this.
Then I got a comment from someone who felt that Richter and Maria both became extremely powerful too quickly, which is a topic I've seen brought up a few times in other internet places. And the more I thought about how to respond, I realised I actually do have a few things to say about Richter, with the way he's been characterised in Castlevania Nocturne, and with how that ties into how the Belmonts have been reimagined in the Netflix Vaniaverse. This video isn't to put the original commenter on blast. I'm actually very grateful because this is an interesting talking point and gives me an excuse to yap some more about Castlevania. I also won't really be talking about Maria's power ascension here, outside of how it relates to Juste Belmont's story in Nocturne. So with that out of the way, let's go smash some candles and talk about the Belmonts, shall we?
What motivates a man to confront the challenges that most of us would run from? Condemning him to solitude, exposing him to defeat and death.
Both Netflix Castlevania series share a bit in common with the Castlevania Lords of Shadow trilogy, in that they took pieces of Castlevania's fairly flimsily held together and sometimes nonsensical video game lore, and then used it to thread together a brand new mythology. In terms of the actual stories, they are very different from each other, as Lords of Shadow was an origin story for Dracula, while Netflixvania attempts to more closely follow the original timeline. But what Lords of Shadow and Netflixvania both do that make them so interesting, to me at least, is that they make the Belmonts far more conflicted characters than their original counterparts. There isn't a whole lot of characterization given to most of the Belmonts in the earlier games, and often their sole motivation for venturing off to fight Dracula is just because that's what the Belmonts do apparently. And this works just fine as a setup in the context of a video game. It's the same kind of logic as the original Doom. You're a lone space marine on Mars killing demons because demons are dicks.
Is that how you understand that story?
And I think this is a big part of the contention some fans have with the Netflixvania series, because while the particular games that the show is adapting had a lot of lore behind them, they didn't really have stories or characterization beyond people's personal headcanons. Though I do agree that Hector could have been given a more satisfying arc in Season 4.
Hector, you are a silly man.
This is why I said in my Nocturne Season 1 video that the stories were never really what drew me to the series in the first place. It was the art direction and the gameplay and the music. There was one exception, however. Castlevania Lament of Innocence, which was the series' origin story, was the first game that I felt had a decent-ish story. And it was interesting that Leon Belmont actually fails in his quest to save his betrothed, Sarah. Instead, he's forced to kill her after she's infected with vampirism, a sacrifice that is used to create the vampire killer whip, and this then strengthens Leon's resolve to destroy evil. This is also apparently why only the Belmonts fight Dracula in the original timeline, because the vampire killer can only be used by a Belmont. Lament of Innocence would end up being one of the key influences for the first Lords of Shadow game, along with Super Castlevania 4. With a number of references scattered across the game, like the castle originally belonging to Walter Bernhard, and with Gabriel's biography stating that he was perhaps a bastard child abandoned by the Kronkovus family, referencing Matthias Kronkovus, who went on to become Dracula. Gabriel and Leon also shared some notable similarities in that both were the first known Belmonts of their universes, both were holy knights that rejected their titles, both were forced to kill their wives, and both were manipulated and betrayed by a supposed friend. The difference between the two is that Leon's failure, as I mentioned, only served to strengthen his heroic resolve, whereas with Gabriel, it left him with nothing but despair that eventually turned to hatred, especially once he cast aside his humanity to become a vampire, ironically, to save the world once again from the Forgotten One in the DLC chapters.
Enough talk! Have at you! But enough talk! Have at you!
Gabriel's story was far more compelling than most of the prior games because while his goal ultimately was to save the world, his true desire was the empty promise of being able to revive his wife Marie, whom he doesn't realize he actually killed. In contrast to Leon again, Marie's death haunts Gabriel across the game, and the long journey that is wonderfully narrated by Sir Patrick Stewart only makes him more bitter and rageful the further it progresses.
You revel in death. We are one and the same, you and I.
You will not stop me.
This made the eventual reveal that Gabriel Belmont became Dracula all the more fascinating for the Lords of Shadow mythos, as now there was a tragically compelling reason for why the Belmont descendants would be forced to fight Dracula, the ramifications of which were explored in the sequel, Mirror of Fate, particularly with Trevor Belmont. After learning the truth about his lineage, Trevor sets off for the castle, vowing to avenge his mother, but sorely underestimates how powerful his father is, and instead meets his demise, failing in his quest. It's only once Gabriel learns that Trevor is his son that he attempts to save him, seemingly in vain, which just enrages him further. Then, in a somewhat controversial move from Mercury Steam, Trevor is reborn 30 years later as a vampire and takes on the moniker of Alucard, helping his own son, Simon Belmont, to temporarily defeat Dracula. I always thought that this was a really cool reinterpretation of the story.
Your father was one of the greatest Brotherhood warriors that ever lived, yet he could not defeat Dracula. What makes you think that you can?
So why have I yapped on about the Lords of Shadow mythology so much when this video is meant to be about the Netflixvania Belmonts? Especially when I said that both Netflixvania series attempt to stick closer to the original lore of the games, flimsy as that may be. As I also mentioned, the Belmonts in both these continuities are much more conflicted characters, and the root of their conflicts, for the most part, stem from failure. This parallel can also be applied to both reimaginings of Alucard too, as they both fail to stop Dracula by themselves. So let's start at the beginning with Trevor Belmont, shall we, before we make our way on to Richter.
It is not dying that frightens us. It's living without ever having done our best. I don't care.
The backstory for Trevor in both Castlevania 3 and Netflixvania does share some similarities, in that both are feared by society and live in seclusion. However, the reason for Trevor's exile in the show is far more complicated. In the game, the church reaches out to Trevor as a last resort to defeat Dracula, whereas in the show, the church excommunicates the Belmont clan, branding them as heretics and then presumably kills them all, except for Trevor, who manages to escape as a child. Trevor is then forced to live a life based purely on survival, moving from place to place, never staying still for too long in fear of being recognized, as we see in the second episode. He hasn't necessarily failed in the same way some of the other Belmonts in this video have, he's more a victim of circumstance. However, unlike his video game counterpart, Trevor has become disillusioned and apathetic, or as the elder speaker put it, he was defeated.
This is what the church wanted. My family were the only people who could have fought Dracula and his army, but they didn't want us. They wanted to fight the darkness on their own terms. Good luck to them.
His arc across the first two seasons is very much of the reluctant hero archetype, with him regaining his resolve to fight when he sees the church persecuting the speakers in the same way they persecuted his family. Despite him being out of practice and still wrestling with self-doubt, we see him quite quickly become a formidable fighter once again, as he goes toe-to-toe with Alucard at the end of Season 1, and single-handedly fends off an ambush of night creatures to protect Cypher and Alucard during Season 2. Remember that this happens over the course of a few days, much like Richter's arc across Castlevania Nocturne.
When you get back to whatever steaming underworld shithole you came from, you tell them there are still Belmonts up here.
Failure strikes once again at the end of Season 3 as the town of Lindenfield is destroyed in an attempted ritual to revive Dracula, forcing Trevor back into a life of survival. However, because of his relationship with Cypher, he retains a sense of hope that he had lost when he was on his own, and ultimately, this leads to him willingly sacrificing himself during the final confrontation against death. It's a beautifully written character arc, and his final fight against death I feel was the perfect way to bookend his story, regardless of whether he survived or not, though I am very glad that he survived. I'll come back to Trevor again later when I talk about Richter, because parts of his personality seem to be distinct traits in the Belmont lineage, but for now, let's talk about one of Nocturne's biggest surprises, Juste Belmont.
Hold on. I need some fucking answers, Grandad.
Please call me anything but Grandad.
Where the fuck have you been all my life? I thought you were dead.
Juste first appeared in the Game Boy Advance title, Harmony of Dissonance, and is described as a powerful spellcaster, due to being a descendant of Cypher and choosing to focus on magic rather than physical combat. The story of Harmony of Dissonance essentially boils down to being a rescue the princess plot, with Juste's primary goal being to save his friend Liddy. Castlevania Nocturne largely ignores the story of Harmony of Dissonance. I'm assuming because the writers are intending to incorporate elements of it much later when they're adapting Symphony of the Night. But Juste's backstory is fairly similar, in that he was the most powerful spellcaster of the Belmont lineage, and that he was married to Liddy and had a best friend named Maxim. We meet this incarnation of Juste as a much older man, who is living as a recluse in France, after he failed to save Liddy and Maxim from a powerful vampire called Lord Reuven. This failure causes him to lose his will to fight, similar to Trevor, and his ability to use magic also leaves him. That last detail creates an interesting parallel between him and his grandson, as Richter also lost the ability to use magic after he attempted to help his mother Julia fight off Olrox, and instead got her killed as she tried to protect him.
Now's your chance to do better then. Maria needs you, Juste, and you owe it to Terra. And, well, you're...
Oh no, I'm a Belmont.
It's not until Season 2 of Nocturne that we see Juste's character arc start to take shape, with him very much being the reluctant hero, again similar to Trevor, at the request of Richter to watch over Maria while he's gone. This also becomes a story of redemption for him, letting go of his guilt and realizing that he is still needed in the fight, with him regaining his magic in much the same way Richter does. It's not explicitly stated in the show, as sadly we didn't get a flashback for Juste, so this could be considered just a headcanon on my part. But if we are to assume that Liddy looked exactly the same as her video game counterpart in Nocturne, I feel that her strong resemblance to Maria is part of why Juste becomes so protective of her so quickly, and why his powers return to save her. Him saving Maria also kind of echoes Peter 3 saving MJ in Spider-Man No Way Home.
I lost Gwen. She was my MJ. I couldn't save her. I'm never gonna be able to forgive myself for that.
I had a wife, your grandmother, Liddy, and a friend, too. A vampire killed them both, all because of me.
So, I just noticed another interesting parallel here in this scene, after rewatching it again for the edit. The last part of Juste's speech about how evil always wins actually echoes what Gabriel says to Alucard in his monologue near the end of Lords of Shadow 2. I don't know if this was intentional, but it's still a fascinating parallel nonetheless.
Evil will always win, Richter. Whatever it is. And you can kill this or that devil, a Lord Ruthven, a Dracula, maybe even an Olrox. But there'll always be more, and they'll murder the people you love. No one around you is safe. Evil will always win.
The mighty Zobek hides from me like the scared rat he is. Even Satan himself is too afraid to leave the pits of hell and fight me. But if I die now, Alucard, they will simply take my place. Evil will prevail. It is the natural order.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
In the final showdown against Urzabat and Drolta, we see Juste join the battle with his powers presumably returned in full force, which does make sense given he is much older than Richter, plus he had also stayed in shape in spite of his depression. It's an interesting arc that he's given, going from being a symbolic representation of Richter's possible future if he gives up, to redeeming himself through saving Maria and not allowing evil to win again.
The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Which finally brings us to Richter, the most conflicted Belmont in the Netflix Vanyaverse, as he exhibits all of the strengths, and, unfortunately, the same shortcomings as his forebearers. Richter shares a lot in common with Trevor, including his cocky sarcasm, as noted by Alucard. Both of their lives are rooted in very similar childhood tragedies. Trevor's family is killed by the church, and Richter's mother is murdered by a powerful vampire. As mentioned earlier, however, Trevor was a victim of circumstance, and there was likely nothing he could have done, and as such, while he's definitely sad about the loss of his family, he's not haunted by it in the same way that Richter is. Richter, on the other hand, is tormented by guilt, because in his attempts to help Julia defeat Olrox, he inadvertently got her killed because she was forced to shift her focus in order to protect him. He's also haunted by the memory of Olrox, who promised to kill him one day, and since then Richter has been unable to use magic, though we were shown that he was already quite a proficient spellcaster at a young age. The rest of Richter's upbringing, however, is different from Trevor, as he escapes to France where he's adopted by Terra and grows up alongside Maria, who he watches become a powerful spellcaster. He grows up to be a formidable fighter and protector, with a smug bravado hiding the fact that the trauma of his mother's death still haunts him. We first start to see Richter dropping this facade in episode 4, when he tries to reason with Annette and requests that they all devise a proper plan, due to how horribly their previous reconnaissance mission at the vampire chateau had failed.
It would be a mercy.
Oh, just walk in and kill him. That sounds foolproof.
It's here where you really start to see the self-doubt that Richter has, and also another similarity he shares with Trevor, in that he automatically assumes what people think of him. He assumes that everyone is calling him a coward, in much the same way that Trevor assumed the Elder was calling him a coward for urging them to leave Gregid.
I didn't run away. Really? So what are you running to?
Are you calling me a coward?
No. I am calling you defeated, Trevor Belmont.
Usually everyone says I'm too rash. The moment I say we need a plan, everyone starts calling me a coward.
No one's calling you a coward, Richter.
Again, it's like poetry.
He does the same thing again in Season 2, assuming that Alucard thinks he's useless, which turns out is far from the truth. Alucard is just irritated by all the Belmonts.
Are all Belmonts like this?
Irritating. Oh yes.
One of the most pivotal moments in his arc occurs later in episode 4, when Olrox reappears before Richter, to which his trauma response causes him to flee in terror, abandoning Maria, Terra, and Annette in the process. It leads to one of the most raw and emotional scenes in the entire series, as we see Richter completely break down into tears by the lake. It's the absolute lowest point for him. In his mind, he's failed yet again, as he doesn't even know if the others have survived, even though it's not really his fault, as he couldn't have possibly predicted that Olrox would show up. But this is how his self-doubt has been eating away at him. I also love that Netflixvania isn't afraid to show its lead characters crying like this, as there is a similar scene at the end of Season 2, where Alucard completely breaks down and laments that his family is gone and that now he's all alone. It makes them feel more human and relatable, which is something you want in a television series.
We really messed up the old house, didn't we?
Richter then meets his grandfather Juste, and upon hearing how the tragedy in his life had reduced Juste to a shell of who he was, Richter starts to begin processing his trauma, and finally regains his magic when a group of vampires reveal that his family is alive and they threaten to kill them. Much like Juste in Season 2, we see during this fight, and in later fights across both seasons, that Richter is extremely proficient with his magic use, in spite of not being able to use it for nearly a decade. So how is this possible, you ask? There are a few things to take into consideration for this. The first being that Richter was already quite a proficient spellcaster as a child, which makes sense if he's the grandson of Juste Belmont, who claimed to be so powerful with magic that he rarely ever used the whip. Even though his ability to cast magic left him, it's very unlikely that he forgot the fundamental teachings of how to do it. He also grew up with Terra and Maria, so he would have observed Maria being taught how to use magic, while he simultaneously trained relentlessly in physical combat. In spite of this, however, he still proved to not be strong enough to defeat Drolta or Erzsébet in the Season 1 finale, instead opting to flee once again to save Maria, as he realizes the odds are completely stacked against him, and the group only survives due to Alucard arriving at the very last moment.
Are you really Alucard? I thought you were just a myth.
The obvious explanation for this is because Season 1 needed to have a cliffhanger, so Richter not being strong enough can be seen as a convenient plot device. However, if you observe his behaviour in Season 2, it's clear that he still hasn't fully resolved the self-doubt caused by his trauma, and he continues to feel like a failure, even though he did the right thing by fleeing the Abbey. It probably doesn't help his confidence either that he had to be rescued by Alucard, and it's evidently clear that Richter quickly grows to look up to Alucard as a mentor, feeling deeply ashamed when he lets slip their destination to the little chonk vampire. Though, similar to his conversation with Juste, Alucard seems to help him put to rest some of his inner turmoil when he suggests that Richter truly admits how he feels about Annette. I think that this, along with seeing Juste and Maria join the fight in Paris, strengthens his resolve immensely, echoing how Trevor's love for Cypher gave him the resolve to confront death, and we see Richter then perform some awe-inspiring combat feats in the final fights against Erzsébet and Agharta. Which brings me back to the initial question of how does he become so powerful so quickly across the 2 seasons? And I think the answer isn't so much that Richter became more powerful, more that he always was this powerful. The trauma of his childhood and his lacking sense of self-worth was holding back his true potential. And if we look back on the other Belmonts in the Netflix Vaniaverse, their abilities and strength do seem to be directly linked to their sense of self-worth. It also seems to be a shared character flaw of the Belmonts that they are very prone to becoming despondent in the face of failure. We see it in Trevor, who felt defeated at the start of Season 1, and we see it in Juste, who had lost the will to fight after losing Liddy and Maxim. And yet, both men then go on to perform legendary combat feats once they regain their resolve and sense of purpose to fight. Julia Belmont is probably the one exception to this rule. It's likely she was a lot more level-headed being a woman, and it's possible she only met her demise at Olrox's hand because she lost her focus having to protect Richter.
I'm sorry, Richter. I know it feels like I'm sending you away.
You are sending me away.
I'm so sorry, my darling. But I have no choice.
I feel like this was a very long answer to a somewhat simple question, but I also feel that a lot of careful consideration was taken when writing his character arc across the first 2 seasons of Nocturne. The writers, I think, have created a very fascinating deconstruction, or reimagination of the Belmont lineage across both series of the Netflix Vaniaverse. I'm glad that the showrunners have not been afraid to take creative risks in how they've adapted these old games into a new medium, in much the same way that I've always been a big fan of how Lords of Shadow reimagined the mythology over a decade ago. Trevor is probably still my favourite Belmont so far in the Netflix continuity, but I love what they've done with Richter and Nocturne so far, and how Trevor's legacy can still be felt in the show through the Belmont descendants. Now, hurry the heck up already, will you, Netflix? Let us finally have the long-awaited adaptation of Symphony of the Night.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
What is a man? But a miserable pile of secrets.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.